The start of Kansas Jayhawk football is a little over 3 months away, and I can hardly wait for this season. It's one of the most anticipated seasons in school history. So, basically, to cope with this, I decided to look at some current player stats and basically give what I consider to be future projections on where they might end up at the end of the season and where that puts them on KU's all-time lists. Should be a good one. Hey, what's up everybody? It's Drew, better known as RockShock01, and in this video, I'm going to go over some current KU football players' future projections. All these guys are going to be on the offensive side of the ball because defense, I would have been here for hours because of tackles, sacks, tackles for loss, pass deflections, interceptions, forced fumbles, fumble recoveries, and defensive touchdowns. Yeah, that's a lot. So I just stuck with the offensive side of things, and I kind of want to go over how I did this. So basically, I compiled each player's total stats for a specific category or categories, and then averaged them out, and then basically projected where that average would put them if they had that the following season, or when in this case, the current season. And then I would compare it to where they were currently sitting on KU's all-time list to what they would be on KU's all-time list. It should make sense once I go through the list, but I've got 9 players that we're going to take a look at, and they'll all be considered from receiving to rushing as well as passing. So let me know in the comments what you guys think. But here we go with my future projections.
Okay, to begin this, we're going to start with a walk-on fullback turned into a scholarship and probable starting tight end, Jared Casey. Casey currently has 432 receiving yards, which is an average of 144 yards per season, as well as 8 receiving touchdowns. He currently sits tied for 89th in career receiving yards and sits tied for 25th in receiving touchdowns. If he is on that 144-yard pace this season, he would finish the season with 576 receiving yards and 11 touchdowns, which would put him 65th in career receiving yards as well as tied for 13th in career receiving touchdowns on the KU all-time list. Now we move on to a guy who is one of the 3 members in KU's 3-headed receiving monster, Quentin Skinner. Skinner currently has 1,027 receiving yards, which is an average of 342.3 yards per season, as well as 7 receiving touchdowns. That currently sits him 34th in career receiving yards on KU's all-time list, as well as tied for 31st in receiving touchdowns. If he has that 342.3 yards per season average on pace, he would finish with 1,370 receiving yards and 10 receiving touchdowns, which would put him 23rd on KU's all-time list in career receiving yards, as well as tied for 15th in career receiving touchdowns. Now we move on to another member of KU's 3-headed receiving monster, and that's going to be Luke Grimm. Luke currently has 1,782 receiving yards, which is an average of 445.5 yards per season, as well as 17 receiving touchdowns. He currently sits 10th in career receiving yards and sits tied for 4th in career receiving touchdowns. If he is on that pace of 445.5 yards per season, he will finish with 2,228 receiving yards as well as 22 receiving touchdowns. This would put him 5th on KU's all-time list in career receiving yards, as well as 2nd in career receiving touchdowns. Now we go on to the final member of KU's 3-headed receiving monster, and that is Lawrence Arnold. LJ currently has 1,859 receiving yards, which averages out to 464.75 yards per season, as well as 13 receiving touchdowns. That puts him 7th in career receiving yards and sits him tied for 10th in career receiving touchdowns. If he is on that 464.75 yard pace, he will finish with 2,324 receiving yards as well as 17 receiving touchdowns. This would put him third on KU's all-time list in career receiving yards, as well as tied for fourth in career receiving touchdowns. Now we move on to a quarterback turned running back, and that's Torrey Loughlin. Loughlin currently has 193 rushing yards, which averages out to 48.25 yards per season, as well as 3 rushing touchdowns. He currently has 219 receiving yards, which averages out to 54.75 yards per season, and 4 receiving touchdowns. He currently sits tied for 131st in career rushing yards, sits tied for 97th in career rushing touchdowns, tied for 148th in career receiving yards, and tied for 53rd in career receiving touchdowns. If he is on pace with his 48.25 rushing yards and 54.75 yards receiving, it will put him with 242 rushing yards, 4 rushing touchdowns, and 274 receiving yards and 5 receiving touchdowns. This would put him 117th in career rushing yards, tied for 80th in career rushing touchdowns, tied for 124 in career receiving yards, as well as tied for 44th in career receiving touchdowns. Now we move on to a guy who hasn't seen much of the field but is a good member of KU's rushing core, and that's Sevion Morrison. Morrison currently has 227 rushing yards, which averages out to 113.5 yards per season, and 2 rushing touchdowns. That puts him 121st in career rushing yards at KU, and sits him tied for 109th in career rushing touchdowns. If he is on that 113.5 yard pace, he will finish with 341 rushing yards and 3 rushing touchdowns. This would put him 98th in career rushing yards, as well as tied for 97th in career rushing touchdowns on KU's all-time list. Now we move on to a guy who is a member of KU's two-headed monster in the backfield, Daniel Hishaw. Hishaw currently has 1,117 rushing yards, which averages out to 372.3 yards per season, and 15 rushing touchdowns. He currently sits 34th on KU's all-time list in career rushing yards, as well as tied for 18th in career rushing touchdowns. If he is on that 372.3 yard pace, he will finish with 1,490 rushing yards and 20 rushing touchdowns. This would put him 23rd on KU's all-time list in career rushing yards, as well as 12th in career rushing touchdowns. Okay, you should have seen this coming a mile away, but the next guy up is the other half of KU's two-headed monster in the backfield, Devin Neal. The real deal currently has 3,077 rushing yards, which averages out to 1,025.6 yards per season, and currently has 33 rushing touchdowns. That sits him 5th on KU's all-time list in career rushing yards, and 3rd in career rushing touchdowns. If you add that pace of 1,025.6 yards per season, he will finish likely his KU career with 4,103 rushing yards and 44 rushing touchdowns. This would put him as KU's all-time career rushing leader in both yards and touchdowns. And finally, we move on to the man who will most likely run this offense if injuries do not plague his season, Jalon Daniels. JD6 currently has 4,297 passing yards, which averages out to 1,074.25 yards per season and 31 passing touchdowns. He also has 602 rushing yards, which averages out to 150.5 yards per season and 13 rushing touchdowns. That currently sits him 9th in passing yards, 5th in passing touchdowns, 68th in rushing yards, and tied for 23rd in rushing touchdowns on KU's all-time lists. If he has his pace of 1,074.25 yards passing and 150.5 yards rushing, Jalon will finish most likely his career with 753 rushing yards and 17 touchdowns, as well as 5,372 passing yards and 39 passing touchdowns. This would put him 57th in career rushing yards, as well as tied for 16th in career rushing touchdowns, as well as 4th in career passing yards, and 2nd in career passing touchdowns. And that's going to do it for the current KU football players' future projections. Let me know in the comments what you guys think. Also, don't forget to leave a like, share, and subscribe, and push that notification bell. Also, tell your friends about these videos. And I should see you again when the next one comes out. But until then, have a good day. Never ever bring exotic dancers to the field house. And I'll catch you on the flip side. Peace.